My true story from Alabama. They said I wasn't family anymore, so I took my name back. My name is Dorothy Mae Jenkins now, but for 47 years, I was Dorothy Mae Henderson. I carried that name like a badge of honor, wore it proudly through decades of sacrifice, love, and devotion. Today, I want to tell you how I lost that name and how I found myself again. Let me start at the beginning, back when I was just Dorothy Mae Whitfield, a 22-year-old girl from Mobile, Alabama, with dreams bigger than the small town I called home. I met James Henderson at a church social in 1953. He was handsome, ambitious, and had a way of making me feel like I was the only woman in the room. When he asked me to dance, my heart practically jumped out of my chest. By Christmas that year, he'd proposed with his grandmother's ring, and I said yes without hesitation. We married in the spring of 1954, and I became Dorothy Mae Henderson. I remember signing that name for the first time on our marriage certificate, the ink still wet with possibility. I was so proud to be his wife, to carry his family name, to become part of something bigger than myself. James came from a respected family in Birmingham. His father owned a successful hardware store, and his mother was involved in every social club in town. They welcomed me with open arms, or so I thought. The early years were a whirlwind of adjustments. James worked long hours at his father's store, learning the business, while I focused on making our little house a home. I planted roses in the front yard, learned to cook his favorite meals, and attended every Henderson family gathering with a smile. I wanted so desperately to fit in, to be the perfect daughter-in-law, the perfect wife. When our first child, Michael, was born in 1956, I thought I'd never been happier. James was over the moon, and his parents were thrilled to have their first grandchild. I threw myself into motherhood with the same dedication I'd given to everything else. 2 years later, Sarah came along, followed by little James Jr. in 1961. Our house was full of laughter, chaos, and love. But somewhere along the way, the cracks started to show. James's mother, Eleanor, had very specific ideas about how things should be done. She'd come over unannounced, rearrange my kitchen cabinets, and comment on how I was raising the children. "Dorothy, dear," she'd say with that sweet smile that never reached her eyes, "perhaps you should consider a firmer hand with Michael. Henderson children need structure." I bit my tongue and nodded, telling myself she meant well. When James's father passed away in 1965, leaving the hardware store to James, I thought things might change. Instead, they got worse. Eleanor moved in with us temporarily to help with the children, while James took over the business. That temporary arrangement lasted 15 years. During those years, I sacrificed pieces of myself daily. I gave up my part-time job at the library because Eleanor thought it wasn't appropriate for a Henderson woman to work. I stopped seeing my own friends because family gatherings took up every weekend. I even stopped playing piano, something I'd loved since childhood, because Eleanor complained it was too loud and disturbed her afternoon naps. The children grew up calling me Mama and Eleanor Grandmama, but somehow Eleanor's word always carried more weight. When Sarah wanted to take dance lessons, Eleanor thought it was frivolous. When Michael showed interest in art, Eleanor steered him toward business courses. I found myself constantly caught between supporting my children's dreams and keeping peace in the household. James, bless his heart, tried to stay neutral, but neutrality often felt like choosing his mother's side. "Dorothy, you know how she is," he'd say when I'd complain about Eleanor's latest interference. "She's just trying to help. She's family." Family. That word became both my anchor and my chain. When the children graduated high school and moved away for college, I thought I'd finally have space to breathe. Instead, I found myself caring for an increasingly demanding Eleanor who developed arthritis and used it as an excuse to control every aspect of our household. I cooked her meals, managed her medications, drove her to doctor's appointments, and listened to her endless complaints about everything from the weather to the neighbors. James and I grew distant during those years. He was consumed with expanding the business, often working late into the evening. When he came home, he was tired and wanted peace, not my concerns about feeling invisible in my own home. We'd sit at the dinner table, James, Eleanor, and I'd realize I hadn't spoken a word all evening except to ask if anyone needed more tea. The grandchildren started arriving in the early 80s. Michael married a lovely girl named Patricia, and they had 2 beautiful daughters. Sarah married her college sweetheart and had 3 boys. Little James Jr., who wasn't so little anymore, brought home a sweet girl named Lisa, and they had twins. I threw myself into being a grandmother with the same intensity I'd brought to everything else. I knitted blankets, baked cookies, and babysit whenever needed. I attended every birthday party, school play, and sporting event. I documented their childhoods in photo albums, saved every piece of artwork, and wrote letters to each grandchild on their birthdays. But even in this role, I felt the subtle ways I was being pushed to the margins. Eleanor, despite her age and arthritis, somehow managed to be the grandmother everyone remembered. She gave the bigger gifts, told the better stories, and commanded the attention at family gatherings. I was the one who did the work, the cooking, the cleaning, the organizing. But she was the one who got the credit. When Eleanor passed away in 1995, I thought I'd finally have my chance to be the family matriarch. Instead, I found that patterns established over decades were impossible to break. The children and grandchildren had learned to look to Eleanor for guidance, and with her gone, they seemed to look through me entirely. James retired that same year, and I hoped we'd reconnect. Instead, retirement seemed to make him more irritable and distant. He'd spend hours at the hardware store, even though he'd sold it, just to have somewhere to go. When he was home, he'd watch television or read, rarely engaging in conversation. I felt like a ghost in my own house. The first real sign of trouble came during Christmas of 1999. Sarah was hosting dinner for the first time, and she was stressed about everything being perfect. I offered to help, bringing my famous cornbread dressing and green bean casserole. When I arrived, I found Patricia in the kitchen, making the same dishes. "Oh, Dorothy," Sarah said, looking embarrassed. "I forgot I'd already asked Patricia to bring those. Maybe you could just put yours away for now?" I stood there holding my casserole dishes, feeling foolish and unnecessary. Patricia smiled sympathetically, but didn't offer to step aside. I put my food in the refrigerator and spent the rest of the evening helping with dishes and cleaning up, while Patricia received compliments on her cornbread dressing. That night, I mentioned the incident to James. He barely looked up from his newspaper. "Don't make a big deal out of it, Dorothy. It's just food." But it wasn't just food. It was the beginning of a pattern that would continue for years. Family decisions were made without consulting me. Holiday traditions I'd maintained for decades were suddenly changed without discussion. My grandchildren started calling Patricia Grandma Pat and referring to me as James's Dorothy, as if I were some distant relative rather than their biological grandmother. The worst part was the photos. For years, I'd been the family photographer, documenting every moment. But gradually, I noticed I was appearing in fewer and fewer pictures. When I asked to be included, someone would always say they'd take one in a minute. But that minute never came. I started to feel like I was disappearing from my own family's history. James's health began declining in 2003. He'd developed diabetes and heart problems, and I became his primary caregiver. I managed his medications, drove him to appointments, and adjusted our entire lifestyle around his needs. It was exhausting, but I did it willingly because I loved him and because taking care of family was what I'd always done. The children visited occasionally, but their lives were busy with their own families and careers. I understood, but it was lonely. Sometimes days would pass without a phone call, and I'd find myself talking to James about memories he could no longer fully access due to his worsening condition. In 2010, James had a massive stroke that left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly. The children gathered to discuss his care, and I expected to be included in the planning. Instead, I found myself sitting in the hospital waiting room while they met with doctors and social workers in private. When Michael finally came to get me, he looked uncomfortable. "Dorothy, we've been talking, and we think it might be best if Dad moved to that nice assisted living facility near Sarah's house. You know, where he can get proper care." I stared at him in shock. Proper care? I've been taking care of him for 7 years. I know his routine, his preferences, his medications better than anyone. "We know you've done your best," Patricia said gently, "but he needs professional care now. This isn't a reflection on you." But it felt like exactly that. It felt like they were telling me I wasn't good enough, that I couldn't handle my own husband's care. James moved to the facility the following week, and I was left alone in our house for the first time in 56 years of marriage. I visited James every day, but the staff treated me like any other visitor. They had their own routines, their own ways of doing things. I'd arrived to find him already fed, bathed, and dressed according to their schedule, not his preferences. When I tried to explain that he liked his coffee with 2 sugars, not 1, they'd nod politely and continue doing things their way. The children visited James regularly at first, but their visits were usually scheduled around my absence. We didn't want to overwhelm him, Sarah explained, when I asked why they always came on the days I stayed home to do errands. I started to suspect they preferred visiting when I wasn't there, though I couldn't understand why. James passed away in his sleep on a Tuesday morning in March 2012. I'd been there the night before, holding his hand and telling him about the cardinals that had been visiting our bird feeder. The nurse called me at 6 in the morning, and I drove to the facility in my nightgown and a coat, my heart breaking with every mile. The funeral arrangements became another source of tension. I wanted a simple service at our church, where we'd been members for decades. The children wanted something bigger, more elaborate. Dad was a prominent businessman, Michael said. People will expect a proper send-off. I found myself nodding along with plans that felt wrong, watching as they arranged a service that bore no resemblance to the man I'd loved and lived with for 58 years. They chose readings James had never liked, music he'd never enjoyed, and speakers who barely knew him. I was allowed to speak, but only after the important eulogies from his business associates and community leaders. Standing at that podium, looking out at a church full of people who'd known James the businessman, but not James the man who sang off-key in the shower and cried at old movies, I felt more alone than I ever had in my life. I spoke about our early days, our dreams, the small moments that had made up our life together. But I could see in the children's faces that they thought I was rambling, that I was holding up the program. After the funeral, people came back to our house for a meal I'd prepared with help from church ladies. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, listening to conversations about James's business acumen and community involvement. No one mentioned his terrible jokes or his habit of leaving love notes in my purse. No one talked about the man who'd held me through 3 miscarriages, or who'd learned to braid Sarah's hair when she was going through her tomboy phase. The weeks following James's death were a blur of paperwork and adjustments. I learned to be alone in ways I'd never imagined. The house felt enormous and empty, every room echoing with memories. I'd catch myself setting 2 coffee cups in the morning or cooking enough dinner for 2 people. The children checked on me, but their visits felt obligatory rather than loving. They'd stay for exactly long enough to be polite, making small talk about the weather or their work. None of them asked how I was really doing or if I needed anything beyond the basics. The first major conflict came when I wanted to host Thanksgiving that year. I'd been cooking Thanksgiving dinner for the family for 42 years, and I needed that tradition to help me through my first holiday without James. When I mentioned it to Sarah, she looked uncomfortable. Dorothy, we've already made plans to have it at Patricia's house. She's got more space, and honestly, we thought it might be too much work for you this year. It's not too much work, I said, hearing the desperation in my own voice. I want to do it. I need to do it. Maybe next year, she said. But I could tell she didn't mean it. I spent that Thanksgiving alone, cooking a small turkey and all the traditional sides, setting the table with my good china, and eating surrounded by empty chairs. I called the children to wish them well, and they all sounded guilty but relieved that I wasn't there to complicate their celebration. That's when I started to understand that I'd become an inconvenience rather than a beloved family member. I was the old woman who needed to be managed, whose feelings needed to be considered but not prioritized, whose presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. The breaking point came during the summer of 2015. My great-grandson, Michael's oldest daughter's son, was getting married. I'd been looking forward to the wedding for months, had bought a new dress, and was excited to celebrate with the family. 3 days before the wedding, Sarah called. Dorothy, I need to talk to you about something delicate. Kevin and Amanda are having a small ceremony, and they're really trying to keep the guest list tight. They're wondering if you might consider, well, if you might sit this one out. I felt like she'd slapped me. Sit this one out? He's my great-grandson. I know, but they're trying to keep it to immediate family only, and with all the divorces and remarriages over the years, the definition of immediate family has gotten complicated. I'm not complicated, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm his great-grandmother. I helped raise his mother. I was there when he was born. It's not personal, Dorothy. They just want to keep things simple. But it was personal. Everything had become personal. I was being systematically excluded from my own family's life, and they were using politeness and practicality as weapons to cut me out. I didn't fight them on the wedding. I spent that Saturday alone, looking through photo albums and wondering when I'd become someone whose absence was preferred to whose presence was celebrated. I found pictures of myself at dozens of family celebrations over the years, always smiling, always supportive, always there. When had I become someone they no longer wanted there? The final straw came during Christmas of 2016. I'd been dropped from the family gift exchange without explanation. I found out when I arrived at Sarah's house with presents for everyone, only to discover that no one had gotten me anything because they didn't think I was participating this year. I sat in Sarah's living room, watching my family exchange gifts and laughter, feeling like a stranger who'd wandered into the wrong house. My great-grandchildren, who barely knew me anymore, politely thanked me for their gifts and immediately went back to playing with toys from family members they saw regularly. That's when Michael's wife, Patricia, made the comment that changed everything. She was talking to Sarah about next year's Christmas plans, and they were discussing whether to rotate hosting duties among the real family members. "What about Dorothy?" Sarah asked, glancing at me. Patricia lowered her voice, but not low enough. "Honestly, it might be easier if we just did it ourselves. She's not really family anymore, is she? I mean, James is gone, and she's just here." The room went silent. Everyone had heard. I looked around at the faces of people I'd loved and sacrificed for, waiting for someone to defend me, to say that of course I was family, that I'd always be family. Instead, I saw embarrassment, discomfort, and something that looked like relief, that someone had finally said what they'd all been thinking. Sarah started to say something, but Michael cut her off. "Patricia has a point. Dorothy, you're always welcome at family events, but maybe it's time to acknowledge that the family dynamics have changed." I set down my coffee cup with hands that were surprisingly steady. "I see. We don't mean to hurt your feelings," Sarah said quickly. "We just think it might be better for everyone if we adjusted our expectations." I stood up, gathered my purse, and looked at each of them one more time. These people I'd given my life to, who'd absorbed my sacrifices like they were their due, who'd gradually erased me from their story while keeping me around to do the work they didn't want to do. "You're right," I said finally. "I'm not family anymore." I drove home in a daze, their words echoing in my mind. Not family anymore. Not family anymore. By the time I reached my house, something had shifted inside me. They were right. I wasn't family anymore. But that meant I was free. I spent the rest of that evening making lists. Lists of everything I'd given up, everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd endured in the name of being a Henderson. I wrote down every slight, every dismissal, every moment when I'd been made to feel invisible or unwanted. It was a long list. Then I made another list. This one was about what I wanted for the rest of my life. At the top, I wrote, "Take back my name." The next morning, I called a lawyer. I wanted to change my name back to Dorothy Mae Jenkins, my maiden name with a small modification to honor my grandmother Jenkins, who'd raised me after my parents died. The lawyer was puzzled but professional. "Are you sure about this, Mrs. Henderson? It's quite unusual for a woman your age to make such a change." "I've never been more sure of anything," I said. The paperwork took several weeks, but on February 14, 2017, Valentine's Day, which felt appropriate for a day of loving myself, I became Dorothy Mae Jenkins. I celebrated by taking myself out to dinner at the nicest restaurant in town, wearing my best dress and holding my head high. The children didn't notice the change immediately. They rarely called, and when they did, they usually launched into their own news without much preamble. It was Sarah who first realized something was different when a piece of mail arrived addressed to Dorothy Jenkins instead of Dorothy Henderson. "Dorothy, there's some mistake with your mail," she said when she called. Someone sent you something with the wrong last name. No mistake, I said. That's my name now. The silence stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. Finally, she said, What do you mean that's your name now? I changed it legally. I'm Dorothy Mae Jenkins now. But why? You've been Dorothy Henderson for over 60 years. And now I'm not. I'm reclaiming my identity. That phone call led to a family meeting, though I wasn't invited. I learned about it from Michael, who came to my house the next day looking agitated and confused. Dorothy, what's this about changing your name? Are you having some kind of episode? I almost laughed. An episode? No, Michael. I'm having a moment of clarity. You all made it very clear that I'm not family anymore. So I'm acting accordingly. That's not what we meant, and you know it. That's exactly what you meant. And you were right. I'm not your family anymore. I'm free. Over the following months, I continued the process of reclaiming my life. I removed all the Henderson family photos from my walls and replaced them with pictures of places I wanted to visit, books I wanted to read, and activities I wanted to try. I sold the house, that big, empty house full of memories of being invisible, and bought a smaller place across town. I joined a book club, started taking art classes, and began volunteering at the library again. I reconnected with old friends I'd lost touch with during my Henderson years. I discovered that Dorothy Mae Jenkins was a much more interesting person than Dorothy Mae Henderson had been allowed to be. The most difficult part was revising my will. I'd planned to leave everything to the children and grandchildren, but I realized I didn't want my life's work to go to people who'd discarded me so casually. Instead, I set up scholarships for young women pursuing education, donated to causes I cared about, and left modest amounts to the great-grandchildren who were too young to have participated in my exclusion. I also wrote letters to each of the children, explaining my decisions. I didn't send them. They were for my own peace of mind. In each letter, I detailed the specific moments when they'd made me feel unwanted, the ways they'd gradually erased me from family events and decisions, and the impact their words and actions had had on my life. Writing those letters was cathartic. I grieved for the relationships I'd thought I had, for the family I'd believed I was part of, and for the years I'd spent trying to earn love that was never freely given. But I also felt a growing sense of excitement about the life I was building as Dorothy Mae Jenkins. The children noticed the changes, of course. Sarah came by my new house once, looking around at the unfamiliar decor and my new life with something like confusion. "This doesn't look like you," she said. "It looks exactly like me," I replied. "You just never bothered to find out who I was." They made a few attempts to include me in family events after that, but it felt forced and awkward. I'd attended a birthday party for one of the great-grandchildren, and the entire time I felt like an outsider being tolerated rather than a beloved family member being welcomed. I left early and decided that was the last family event I'd attend. The freedom was intoxicating. For the first time in decades, I could make plans without considering anyone else's schedule or preferences. I could eat what I wanted, when I wanted. I could decorate my house to reflect my tastes instead of trying to please everyone else. I could pursue interests that had nothing to do with being useful to ungrateful family members. I started traveling, something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for. I visited my cousin in Oregon, took a trip to New England to see the fall foliage, and even splurged on a cruise to Alaska. On each trip, I met interesting people who knew me only as Dorothy Jenkins, a widowed woman with stories to tell and adventures to pursue. One of my travel companions, a woman named Ruth, became a dear friend. She'd had a similar experience with her own family, though not as dramatic as mine. "The thing about being erased," she told me over coffee in a cafe in Portland, "is that it makes you realize how much of yourself you'd given away without even noticing." She was right. I'd spent so many years trying to be the perfect wife, mother, and grandmother that I'd forgotten to be myself. Dorothy Mae Henderson had been a carefully constructed persona designed to please others. Dorothy Mae Jenkins was authentic, complicated, and gloriously independent. The children still called occasionally, but our conversations were strained. They seemed to want the old Dorothy back, the one who'd been available for every need and never complained about being overlooked. When I didn't immediately offer to help with their problems or express enthusiasm for their plans, they'd end the calls quickly. I felt sorry for them, honestly. They'd lost someone who'd loved them unconditionally, who'd sacrificed everything for their happiness, and they didn't even seem to understand what they'd thrown away. But that was their loss, not mine. My 75th birthday arrived in March 2018, and for the first time in decades, I planned my own celebration. I invited my book club friends, my art class companions, and a few neighbors I'd gotten to know. We had a wonderful party with food I actually enjoyed, music I loved, and conversations that included me rather than flowing around me. The children sent cards and flowers, but they didn't come to the party. I hadn't expected them to. They'd made their choice, and I'd made mine. That night, as I cleaned up from the party, I looked at myself in the mirror and hardly recognized the woman staring back. She had bright eyes, a genuine smile, and an air of confidence that Dorothy Mae Henderson had never possessed. She looked younger, happier, and more alive than I'd felt in years. "Hello, Dorothy Mae Jenkins," I said to my reflection. "It's nice to finally meet you." As I write this letter, it's been 3 years since I reclaimed my name and my life. I'm 78 years old, and I've never been happier. I have genuine friends who value my company, interests that fulfill me, and a future that excites me rather than frightens me. The children have their own lives, their own families, their own traditions that don't include me. They've proven they can function perfectly well without my sacrifices and support. Sometimes I wonder if they miss me at all, or if they only miss the services I provided. I don't hate them. Hate would give them too much power over my emotions. Instead, I feel a kind of sad acceptance. They were raised to take my devotion for granted, to see me as a resource rather than a person. In some ways, that's my fault too. I taught them that my needs didn't matter, that my happiness was less important than theirs. But I've learned that it's never too late to change the story. I may have spent 60+ years being someone else's version of myself, but I still have time to be authentic. Every day as Dorothy Mae Jenkins is a gift I give myself, a small rebellion against the idea that women my age should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention and respect we receive. To any woman reading this who recognizes herself in my story, I want you to know that you have choices. You don't have to accept being erased, dismissed, or taken for granted. You don't have to be grateful for the privilege of being ignored. You have the power to reclaim your identity, to set boundaries, and to demand the respect you deserve. It won't be easy. There will be people who tell you you're being selfish, ungrateful, or difficult. They'll try to make you feel guilty for prioritizing your own happiness. But remember that these are often the same people who've been benefiting from your selflessness without ever acknowledging the cost to you. You are not too old to start over. You are not too old to reclaim your name, your identity, your dreams. You are not too old to demand better treatment or to walk away from relationships that diminish you. I wish I could tell my younger self that being loved shouldn't require erasing yourself. That real family doesn't make you earn your place at the table. That being needed isn't the same as being valued. But I can tell you that now. And I can tell you that on the other side of that painful recognition, on the other side of those difficult conversations and brave choices, there's a version of yourself waiting. She's been patient, that woman. She's been waiting for you to remember that you matter, that your happiness counts, that your story is worth telling. My name is Dorothy Mae Jenkins, and this is my true story. I gave everything to people who saw my devotion as their due. I sacrificed my identity to be part of a family that ultimately rejected me. But in losing them, I found myself. And that, my dear, turned out to be the greatest gift of all. Letters from Grandma. Real stories from real women who lived, loved, and learned that it's never too late to choose yourself.